In Module 24, we will learn how to eliminate public network exposure of Azure PaaS services. At the end of this module, you should be able to, one, assess the attack surface, configure private endpoints, um, expose internal services privately, or learn how to do that, and four, enforce adoption at a scale. Before we jump into the Microsoft portal, what is the business problem? Let's set the stage over here. At Contoso, a penetration test exposed a serious weakness. Attackers used stolen Microsoft Entra credentials to access Azure services from outside the corporate network. Because Azure Blob Storage, SQL, Key Vault, and Azure OpenAI still accept the requests through public endpoints, valid credentials were enough to reach sensitive resources. The attackers exfiltrated data and made unauthorized AI inference calls without ever entering the trusted network. The lesson is clear. Identity protection alone is not sufficient. The organization must reduce network exposure by using Azure Private Link and private endpoints. Then enforce those controls consistently with Azure policy across the environment at the scale securely. Let, let's get started. As always, we are going to start at the Microsoft Azure portal at portal.azure.com. And if we look back at the scenario that we are trying, the problem that we're trying to solve, Acontoso, the pen tester, identified four categories of PaaS resources with public endpoint exposure. When we're talking about PaaS, we're talking about, a platform as a service, right? And so each category presents distinct risks and requires private endpoint deployment with public access disabled. Now, we're talking about Azure SQL databases, for example. The current exposure in the environment is that it has public endpoints with IP firewall rules. And one security risk is that you could use SQL injection attacks combined with credential theft, which will enable complete database dump from external location. The recommendation or the recommended control, private endpoint. Um, the same thing with Azure Blob Storage. If you have, public endpoint, some containers use the share access signature or SAS tokens, right? Uh, which the security risk here is that data exfiltration to external storage accounts, unauthorized download of blob containers, and all that kind of stuff. So again, private control. So let's take a look at this. Let's go into, you could look for, storage here and then go to storage accounts, but I already have it here. Let's take a look at some of this storage account. And let's click one of these. And if we go into the security plus networking section, um, well, first of all, we're talking about access keys, the share access signatures that, if this is enabled, again, there's a lot of security that you could put into this and that kind of stuff. But remember that still, if it's access from the internet, it's accessible. It doesn't matter how many controls you have on on a um, on a PaaS resource, platform as a service. Yes, you could have a lot of controls, but again, uh, the cyber criminals are very, very smart, and there's always a way to get in if you're connected to the internet. So the solution again is to disable that internet connectivity. So how do we do that? Obviously, the encryption would help, and the defense in depth comes at really important. But what we are interested in this case, we're interested in the networking component, right? So the public access. So here we can configure access to this storage account using virtual networks, IP address ranges, or network security perimeter, which is the new thing that should be, right? But notice how um, it says over here that a public network access, right? It's enabled, and what this means is that um, this access allows resources to be accessible over the internet, and that's the main problem. So this means that anyone on the internet can potentially access the resource. To minimize security risks, select an option that restricts inbound and outbound access to this. So this is what we are talking about. Okay. And so if I click on manage, then from here, we can basically disable internet access. Now, you have to be careful with this. Um, because disabling public network access will make this disable not available unless you have properly configured that private access that we are here for. But the point is that depending on the business case, let's say that uh, we identify that this account, it's a problem, and we need to configure this. Well, then this is what you would do. But before you do that, again, and Microsoft recommendation is to use these um, uh, the secure by perimeter. We talked about this in a previous video. So if you are not familiar with secure by perimeter, then I would encourage you to do so. But basically, this would restrict inbound and outbound access using a network security perimeter. Secure by the perimeter offers, basically, secure by perimeter offers the greatest level of inbound and outbound restriction to secure your resource. But again, actually, we don't want that. So we could also, again, so we could create endpoints, and that's what we're talking about. Now, when you click on enable from the selected networks, um, yes, you could obviously um, you know you could add a virtual network, and to configure this you could have a specific range instead of, I mean, this would be a lot more secure when when you do that, but still the problem remains that it is accessed from the internet. So and we have talked about this in the in previous videos, but it's important to understand how this works. We have seen then how it's dangerous to have this endpoints, the services like SQL, uh, storage accounts, and key vaults, for example, how dangerous it is to have them access to the internet. So back in the Azure portal, let's take a look at key vaults. So again, you could look for key vault, or if you have used it, it'll be right here. And so here are a couple of key vaults. Let's take a look at one of these. And There is an entire module about Key Vault. So if you haven't watched that, then and you are preparing for this certification, you have some work to do. But anyway, so if we are here on the settings section, we click on networking, and so notice how the disable public access it's is chosen here, and this is what we want. So basically, we have completely now disabled access to this Key Vault from the internet. Okay, and what that means is that in order for this to work, you need to have private endpoint connections. And this is what this will show. So private endpoints allows access to this resource using a private IP address from a virtual network, effectively bringing the service into your virtual network. So everything is into the Microsoft backbone. Nothing goes off the internet. So people won't be able to find it, discover, or try to do anything. So if we click on this, just look at some of the properties of this private endpoint. But here you'll see some of the essentials information, right? And you could use application security groups. This will configure network security as a natural extension of an application structure. ASG allows you to group virtual machines and define network security policies based on those groups. And we talked about this in previous videos. So here you can look at the DNS configuration. So obviously you need private DNS for these things also to work. And that's what the private link it's about. We talked about private links, and some more information about the properties and stuff like that. Now we're not going to get into the whole creating the private link. So remember that this is a more of a kind of like a cybersecurity class. But anyways, this is where you would create those private endpoints if you wanted to do that. But this is mainly a networking component. As a cybersecurity engineer, you need to um, make sure that this thing is in place. And basically, based on the scenario that we saw at Contoso, that would be the job to make sure that internet is disabled and the private endpoints it's being used. Another important concept that we have discussed in this lesson is that of a private link. If you search for private link in the Azure portal, you will come to this is all part of the network foundation section. But uh, private endpoint, so again, will connect to a private link resource and bring that resource directly into your virtual network. Okay, that's basically what it does. It accesses services privately within your virtual network without going to the internet, and therefore enhances security and compliance. And it will prevent data exfiltration of the internet the way that what we're talking about. And you can click on create and again follow the steps. But that would be more of the a network feature over there. So so if you want to provide secure access to your resources, again, that's what the private link service does. It consumes private, secure, and scalable services from your virtual network. And again, you can configure that there. And we have also talked about the network security perimeters in the previous videos, but all of that is done from here. If we want to, we already saw some of this, but if you want to look at some of the, um, private endpoints that we have created, we actually looked at the the Key Vault one over there. So these are the private endpoints that have been created. And if you have any pending connections, you can see that over here. Here are the private link services. We don't have any, but if you needed to create one, then this is the place where you would do that, and you follow the instructions. Again, that's more of a network task than anything else. But anyway, so those are the main features that you need to understand from for the exam perspectives. With all these settings in Azure, not necessarily the private links, but one aspect that it's important to understand is the drift problem and prevention strategy. So let's say a developer deploys a new Azure SQL database and uses the default networking settings, like what we just did, public endpoint enable, firewall rules set to allow all Azure services, that kind of stuff. So you come in and change this thing manually. Now, 3 weeks later, a penetration test or a Defender for Cloud recommendation flags the resource. The security team remediates it manually, but by then the resource had sensitive data for weeks with public exposure. So that's what, when we're talking about the drift problem. And so, how do we solve something like that? And this is where Azure Policy comes in. And we have talked a lot about Azure Policy already. And there is actually a whole video about that. But it's important to understand that from this perspective. So if we go into Azure Policy, again, you could look for Azure Policy here, but we already have it. If we look for Azure Policy, and let's say that we want to um, kind of prevent that issue when it comes to this this things over here. All right, so let's look at there may be some definitions. So let's look for private endpoints, for example. Okay, here we go. So we have a lot actually related to private endpoints, private DNS. Configure private DNS for a table, private desktop, private endpoint should be enabled. Okay, so here's one. It says this one is private endpoint should be enabled for PostgreSQL service. So instead of configuring this thing, the whole point about Azure policy is to prevent those those drift, right? The drift problem that when you configure something manually, something may change, but when you do it with a policy, the policy will make sure that this is enforced. So if we want to do this, again, we will click on assign this policy and follow the steps that we've been here many times. But I wanted to, because it's important to bring into context that when you do any configuration, if something can we do with a policy definition, that's the best practice. In summary, this module showed how Contoso fixed a major security weakness by removing public access to Key Vault PaaS services. The same thing could be done with Azure SQL databases, blob storage, Key Vault again, and Azure OpenAI, where basically we moved behind the private endpoint. So that's the whole idea. So traffic now stays inside the virtual network instead of traveling over the public internet. Public access was disabled and storage um, fully qualified domain names now resolved to private IP addresses. As a result, attackers outside the network can no longer reach those services, even with the stolen credentials. We also saw that Azure Policy also enforces the standard across subscriptions, flags non-compliance resources, and helps ensure private endpoint adoption uh, remains consistent, secure, and measurable throughout the environment. With this module, we conclude the implement network security controls learning path. So here we started with uh, segment and isolate Azure uh, workloads using network security controls. We then looked at how to centralize and enforce traffic inspection using Azure Firewall, secure remote and hybrid connectivity using VPN gateways and Microsoft Entra Private Access. And then finally, which is the module that we are right now, we are into eliminate public network exposure of PaaS services. Next, so if we go back to this is the uh, entire certification learning path, the Microsoft Certified Cloud and AI Security Engineer, the SC-500 that we are going through. And so basically, we are here, okay, which is Path Learning 6. The next series of videos, so still we are like halfway. The next series of videos is Implement Security for AI. So if we click on this, this is a long learning path, okay? But we are going to start with the secure access for Microsoft Entra Agent, Entra Agent Identity, Microsoft Entra Agent Identity. So that's going to be our next module. Next is the Analyze AI Identity Risk using Microsoft Defender XDR. Um, then we will move to enable real-time protection for Copilot Studio agents. Then configure AI gateway and security in Microsoft Foundry. Then we will move to configure and manage guardrails in Microsoft Foundry. Protect AI workloads with Microsoft Defender for Cloud. Enable Defender for AI Services workload protection in Microsoft Defender for Cloud. Manage agents using Microsoft Agent 365. Identity AI data risks using Microsoft Purview data security patches management. So a lot of modules in this. This is long um, a long learning path, but again, this is where we're going next in our journey to the SC-500 certification exam. Thanks for watching, and I hope that you continue accompanying me on this exciting journey.